pal Hondo doing another video on another subject, survival subject slash history subject. This video is what a early mountain man would have carried in the old days, from going back to the early Kentucky settlers who settled, like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, settling Kentucky and parts of Texas, and the early Kit Carson and Lois and Clark adventures, what everyday mountain man EDC carrying kit would have comprised of. I have some modern examples and replicas of what a mountain man would have carried on him, from his fire kit to his EDC self-defense kit, what he would have carried, basically hand-to-hand self-defense kit, what he would have carried. I don't have the guns, but I do have the blades and the fire kits, so we're going to break it down. I'm going to show you what replicas of what a mountain man would have carried in his everyday carry kit for survival. They use these tools for survival, to fend off native tribesmen, to fend off marauding banded Mexicans, or each other. A mountain man would get drunk and just, at a camp meeting, and somebody might die, hand-to-hand combat, or, a duel or something along that line. So this would be a basic mountain man everyday carry kit, EDC for a mountain, from the late 18th century and early 19th. Hey folks, welcome back. I'm going to show you, first we're going to start off with the blades, what a mountain man would have carried on him in the field in the late 18th century, early 19th century. First we're going to start with the blades. The first blade would have been a very similar blade to this one, a camp Bowie knife. Very similar. The Pennsylvania Knife Company used to make this style of knife. This is the Ontario Old Hickory design, but the old Pennsylvania Knife Company from the early Hudson Bay era would have used riveted pins instead of these more modern pins, but they still would have used the hickory handles. These were a really cheap knife for a mountain man to acquire. They would have used these knives and bought a bunch of these knives in the trading posts. A bunch of them. When I say they would have bought a bunch of these, I mean they would have bought them by, like, 20 or 30 of these knives. With they would make handmade sheaths for one reason, for trading, and they would have bought tin pans as well to trade with the native tribesmen, because the native tribesmen would have rather had a knife than money, or a tin pan to boil stuff, because early native tribesmen were using clay pots and jars to boil water and boil their meat into stews. So tin pan would have been a very great, useful tool right along with a knife, because most of the knives that the native tribesmen were using were stone and they would break easy. So a carbon steel knife like this Ontario Old Hickory would have been a blessing to an Indian, and would have been more than willing to trade whatever furs they would have procured from other various tribesmen they traded stuff for to the early mountain men, to gain carbon steel knives and tin pots and pans. This is the same design they've used for 200 years. It's a camp Bowie. Very rustic type of knife, very simple knife, very easy to make. They could mass produce these knives by the hundreds in the late 18th century by cutting out 1095 carbon steel blanks to make them, and then heat treating them and throwing a handle and riveting them on there. This was probably the most important part of a mountain man's kit, was a knife. Later on, they started getting more fancy knives in the Old West era, like the Arkansas toothpicks and the press folder buoys and stuff like that were later on in the old Western times. This was just a common man's knife, for just, to beat it up. This is what he would have took with him everywhere he went, or a smaller version of this type of knife to wear around his neck. He would have made his sheaths out of buckskin or buffalo hide or anything of the time that they could use. Basically, whatever they could procure to make a sheath for these knives to trade with the Indians. because the Indians put a lot of emphasis on blades. They were a blade culture, and a carbon steel knife to an Indian would have been a godsend when they were always using stone tools. So that's why they would use this style of knife, very similar to what the mountain men were using. Very common knife, very easy to procure in the field, a bowie type of camp bowie. The next item that the mountain man would have carried on him would have been a very similar hatchet to this. This is a tomahawk. They would have carried more of a French Frank axe, or what they would have commonly called a Cherokee tomahawk. This spike design is more of a modern concept. This is a modern equivalent in my kit that I have of the only tomahawk I own, which is a SOG. The original tomahawks would have been wooden handled, easy to make, mass produced by blacksmiths on the ground during the old settler days. They were made out of carbon steel usually. They were easy to make. Wood handles were easy to carve for them. They could buy them very cheap, the mountain men could, and this would have been his everyday carry, because he would have left his main big axe and stuff like that back at his cabin where he was operating out of. He would have carried this in his boot or on the side of his hip with a leather holster on it. He would have used this for a hand-to-hand combat weapon. He would have used this for chopping wood, splitting wood in the camp, in the field, where he would have made it like a rustic shelter to stay in while he was hunting away from his cabin deep in the woods. An all-around good tool that they would have carried, hand-to-hand combat, chopping wood and such. This is they would have carried a tomahawk on them. Next, we're getting into the fire kit. We're going to get into the more primitive fire kit that he may have carried on him, which would have been a bow drill or a hand drill set. The bow drill would have been more a thicker type of wood, maybe made out of cottonwood or tulip poplar if he was in the Appalachian Mountains. Cottonwood being out in the west, maybe cedar out west, because up here in the Appalachian Mountains we don't have too many cedar trees, if at all. Very few birch trees as well. Birch made a good bow drill as well. They would have had a very similar heartboard to this. They would have had a horseweed like this, which grows basically all around the world. This is a horseweed hand drill spindle, or you can cut it down to a smaller spindle for a bow drill. This is pine. I wouldn't use pine for a bow drill set, but they would have used like tulip poplar or willow or a basswood or a cedar or that type of wood to make a hearthboard for this. And they would have used you set the hearthboard like this, and then you would step on one end and put a little leaf under the other bit to catch the ember, and you would have rolled your hand down like this to start a fire. That would have been the more primitive fire making kit that they would have carried on them, because they could basically make it out of anything they find on the ground. That would have been the horseweed or the tulip poplar or cedar or bow drill, hand drill, whatever they make. Different climates had different types of things. Like out west, they would have used a dead saguaro cactus hearthboard and a horseweed spindle. The native tribesmen there for years used that. From the Navajo to the Apaches would use that type of hand drill setup as well. The next bit, the fire kit that we're going to show you is this would have been this is a period correct Townsend flint and steel wallet fire starting case. They would have used rawhide or a lighter type of buckskin to make these. They were cheap to make. A mountain man can make one of these in the field, no time flat, by sewing it together. It opened up like this. They would carry in this fire kit, they would carry several things. They would carry this is a very period correct Hudson Bay flint and steel striker. They would have carried this with them to hit on a piece of stone, or they would have used the back of their carbon steel knife into a piece of charred material to start a fire. like the back of the carbon steel knife they would have used to hit a piece of flint to start a fire, or they would have carried, most of them always carried one of these because they were easy to make. They could make one out of a file, or just go to a blacksmith and they'll make one for them for 10 cents. It was cheap. Like I said, these knives as well were cheap. They could have bought these for like 10 cents a piece, like 20 of them for 10 cents, and then traded them for beaver pelts from the native tribesmen. They also probably traded stuff like this as well to the native tribesmen. They would have carried a small magnification lens to start a fire as well, like this. Not similar to this, but close to this. They would have carried a small one without a case and a smaller leather pouch they would have carried inside of this to make magnification fire if they didn't want to use their flint and steel striker. They would have carried this as well in their fire kits. They would have carried some cordage, which a lot of them probably carried jute twine. This is jute cordage. They would have carried this on them as well. Or they would have used a natural fibrous bark like tulip poplar, or they would have carried that inside of here as well to help them start the fire, and then they would have put like pieces of fat wood or small branches on top of it and blew it to flame, kind of thing. This type of fire kit's still usable in a modern survival scenario as well. They would have carried a few pieces of choice pieces of flint with them as well in this kit. I carry this kit on me actually everywhere I go in the field. It's a very good kit as well. I like this kit. It's still a usable kit for a modern fire making standpoint. What's old ain't never broke, so why try to fix it kind of scenario. And the final bit of this kit, what he would have carried on him, would have been a small tobacco tin, but this is as close as I can get to a small tobacco tin. Most of the tobacco tins at the time were for smothering natural materials like punk woods, sometimes cloth, but very rarely they would burn 100% cotton cloth. They would use maybe dandelions or whatever, but mainly they would have charred punkwood. What charring is you take the charred punkwood from my previous video, like I showed you how to do this, is you put it in a fire with the tongs and you drop the charred material in here, and by closing it off you cut the oxygen off with the smothering tin. They would have used early 18th century, late 18th century, early 19th century tobacco tins to do this. They were made out of brass. Some of them were highly elaborate and ornate. Some were just common. They would have just had a lid that you'd open and close. They would always put their smothering tins by their fireplaces, or they would carry them on them in the field full of charred material like this. This is punkwood. This thing will take a spark quick. I mean, you could use the magnification lens to get a spark in there. Then you would lay your, after you get a spark in there from your flint and steel kit, you would take your tinder, like your bark or your jute twine tinder, lay it on top, and then blow it to flame, and it would blow it to flame all the time. Or you could take a piece of this charred material out and sit it on the ground, like right here, and then take your flint and steel striker and have the flint striker in one hand and strike the stove downwards, and it would land the spark into the charred material. Then you place it into a tinder bundle and blow it to flame. Well, folks, this is the overall kit, not including the bow drill piece. This would have been also part of the bow drill fire kit as well. What the type of bow drill they would have used to start a fire, very similar to the bow drill they would have used. A green branch with a piece of natural material on it to start a fire. Well, folks, I hope you like this examples of what a mountain man would have carried on him in the field for his EDC fire kit and hand-to-hand combat fire kit. because they would have used these tools after they would have shot all their musket balls off in volleys with their Kentucky rifles or their Pennsylvania long rifles, and they would have went to their hand weapons to fend off the native tribesmen or bandits or themselves in the field. Well, I hope you like these small examples of what a mountain man would have carried on him in the late 18th century, early 19th century. If you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe. And y'all know what you can do. You put God first, you put you first. This has been your old pal Hondo from Hillbilly Tactical.
Yeah, I ain't gonna lie.